Gotten really quiet. I guess we should get started. It would just looks like some people are trickling in. Yeah, why don't we go ahead and get rolling here? So this session is how is homeschooling changing? What are the legal barriers to innovation? I'm going to introduce the panelists. We have Angela Watson. She's Senior Research Fellow at Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy and also an Assistant Research Professor there as well. In the school, it's called the School of Education there, correct? Yes. Okay. And then we have Dalena Wallace, and she is founder of AIM Educational Collaborative, which I think stands for Autonomous, Innovative, and what's the final word? Missional. Okay, great. And Alycia Wright, who's in the program, was not able to make it. She came down with an illness, but we have Carrie McDonald here, who is willing to fill in. So, not a bad replacement, apparently. And she is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Economic Freedom. Education Freedom, excuse me.
Foundation for Economic Education.
Foundation for Economic Education. Okay, FEE, right? Okay. All right, very good. So Angela's going to lead us off, so I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you all for coming. So Dr. Angela Watson from Johns Hopkins School of Ed. I am a research professor there, which means I spend the majority of my time conducting research, and right now that is on homeschooling and microschooling. I am the creator of the Johns Hopkins Homeschool Hub and the Associated Research Lab at Johns Hopkins. So basically what the Homeschool Hub is, if you haven't heard of it, and I have a wonderful handout here you're welcome to come and get, but you can scan the QR code and get there as well. It's basically a catalog of all data and information on homeschooling from across the 50 states. So we've brought it all together and put it in one place. And you can click that little download data button there and download in seconds 20 years worth of longitudinal data on homeschool attendance for all across the country. So we have that available for folks to use. In the research lab, what we are working on is generating new information and knowledge about homeschooling through our research and various collaborations. So I'm going to be sharing some of that with you today. When people talk about homeschooling with me and they ask about the research, the first thing they always ask about, and we heard about this in the opening session, is they want to know about the outcomes. And I want to know about the outcomes too, but first we really need to have a good understanding of the fundamental facts about what we're even talking about when we're talking about homeschooling. And so I have been spending a lot of time looking at some of these really fundamental questions, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. When people talk about homeschooling and they aren't in possession of the facts about what we're really talking about, it's a problem because we are influencing policy, we're out in the world advocating for or against things, but our foundational understanding of what we're even talking about is all messed up and doesn't really reflect what's actually happening. And so then that generates flawed policy or just a complete ignoring of the topic because we don't even know we should care about it, right? So what we're going to talk about today then is these really fundamental things that we've been working on. Who are we talking about when we're talking about homeschoolers? What are these people actually doing? Where is this thing happening? And then why and how are homeschoolers making this happen? So why should we really care about homeschoolers? 4.5 to 6% of the K-12 population in the United States homeschools. So these numbers are a little different than what Mike presented, and so the reason for that is the 4.5 is what we think, what I call state-registered homeschoolers. These are people that are reporting their homeschooling practice, their homeschooling participation to the state. The 6% comes from the U.S. Census Household Pulse Survey. So these are anonymous responses from a nationally representative sample of the population. In that, 6% of the population says that they are homeschooling. So it's possible they're confused and they don't understand about what they're doing. It's also possible that that number is higher because they are reporting anonymously as opposed to reporting it to their state. And so we think 4.5 is about the floor, 6% is probably more accurate, but whatever, we don't know the exact number. It may not sound like that much, 6%, but when you compare that to 9% of the population of students in the United States in private schools, 7% in charter schools. You start to understand the magnitude of this population. Also, it's important to understand that these are single point in time estimates. What that means is that 6% tells us about how many homeschoolers are homeschooling today. It doesn't tell us anything about how many people were homeschooled yesterday and how many people are going to homeschool tomorrow. So I'm going to show you some information that you will start to understand why that distinction is important. So, who homeschools? So what exactly who are we really talking about? And so what you'll hear when you talk to people about homeschooling is people outside of homeschooling will say, well, most homeschoolers are, and then they fill in with some, well-worn stereotype that may or may not be based in fact. And so what I most often hear are most homeschoolers are white. That is indeed the case. Most homeschoolers are white. That is because the majority of the United States population identifies as white. and so what we see here are data from the U.S. Census Pulse survey, and you can see that when we compare homeschool population to public school population and private school population, they're largely representative of the larger U.S. population, percentages by proportion. They're also largely representative of their peers in other sectors, right? So we see here that they look very much like, homeschool families look very much like their traditional public school and private school peers. Here we look at this distinction by parental education. Here we see that most homeschool parents have at least some college. They look most similar to the orange bar, which is the traditional public school parents. Here we look at income. Most homeschool parents make less than $100,000 a year. They look very much most similar to public school parents. These are not wealthy families. And here we look at, this is adult parent response on the Pulse survey about their own LGBTQ status. Homeschool parents are actually more diverse than both their public school peers and their private school peers on this measure. Homeschool parents are more likely than those other two groups to say yes, that they identify as LGBTQ or that they identify as other. So then the next question, what? What exactly counts as homeschooling? So what we have here is new work from Albert Chang, looking at the nationally representative survey of the population, looking then within that at homeschoolers. And here we see, down there at the bottom, 10% of homeschool families, of people who say they were homeschooled, 10% of them are homeschooled for all years of their education. That means that 90% of homeschoolers are moving in and out of other sectors throughout their education career. This should fundamentally change who you think about when you think about homeschoolers. And from a research perspective, because that's what I think about all day long, from a research perspective, this should fundamentally change the questions that we're asking when we think about homeschooler outcomes, because what even counts as homeschooling? Are you a homeschooler? Are we looking at homeschooler outcomes if you were ever homeschooled? Or maybe we said, okay, you have to be 3 years to be a real homeschooler, or 5 years, or 8 years, or does it have to be 12? I don't know. The other thing to note here is that these kids are moving in and out of the public schools. So we don't see large percentages of kids moving in and out of private religious or non-religious. This slide is also really important because the stereotype that we often hear is that homeschoolers do this thing for an ideological reason, and that's true for some homeschoolers. But if that were true for the majority of homeschoolers, I don't think we would see this prevalence of switching in and out, right? They would be dedicated to it, and no matter what, they're doing it always. But what we see here, 50% of kids are only homeschooled 1 to 3 years who say that they have ever been homeschooled. Okay, so where is this thing happening? So when we talk about where, we usually talk about it from a national perspective, but there's a lot of nuance hidden in looking at regional, state, and even local, where these things are happening. So I'm going to be showing you some state data. So these are data that come from 20 states that report homeschooling publicly. We collect that data then and look at it. This is for last academic school year. So the most recent that there is available, we're still collecting this data. I just got a new state yesterday. We have data from 20 states. That doesn't sound like much, but only 30 states report. So we've got 2/3 of all available data in hand right now. We're waiting on the rest. What we see in the majority of these states is what we're calling a rebounding trend. So we had a peak, here's Arkansas, we had a peak at the pandemic. Homeschooling went down. That's what we all thought was going to happen, that homeschooling would drop down a little bit and continue to drop down, get back to normal, once things after the pandemic got normal. That is not what we're seeing. We saw the post-pandemic decline. The green bar indicates homeschooling is going back up. We see this in Arkansas, in Colorado, in Delaware. Delaware had a 30% increase in homeschooling over the prior year. Some states it was 2 or 3%, not super exciting. So some states small, some states large, but what it definitely is not is a decline. Then Georgia. And then I have 11 more states that if I had time I could show you these rebounding trends in these states. We have 3 states that have continuous growth. This means that there was never a post-pandemic decline. They're just up, up, up to the moon. And then we only have 2 states out of the 20. So that's 90% of states that we have are showing an increase in homeschooling. 2 states are showing a decline, New Hampshire, Vermont. New Hampshire, we think that that's because students are checking out of officially being homeschooled because they're taking the ESA and now they're called some other classification. They're not counted in that homeschool pot of numbers anymore. So, unclear exactly what's happening in New Hampshire and whether that's a real decline. I suspect it is not. And then in Vermont, we don't know what's going on. So I'm open. If anybody, if anybody knows, let me know.
Pre-pandemic, though.
Vermont?
Yeah. Isn't it?
No, I think it's down. Yeah, pre-pandemic. Yeah, it's over pre-pandemic. Also, the thing I want to say about this that was brought up in the earlier session, these numbers are while enrollment and babies apparently are going down. These are numbers. These aren't percentages. So these are actual counts. So enrollment's going down, population is going down. These counts are going up. So it's very interesting. Not this slide, obviously. These are going down, but the other ones. Okay, so here's what all of that I just told you looks like on a map. I really like maps because it helps to kind of visualize what we're talking about. This isn't red states. This isn't blue states. This isn't East Coast, West Coast. This is across the country. We see this happening. Green states are increasing. Red states are the 2 declining states. Yellow states are states that do report state data annually. We're just waiting on that to come in. It hasn't come in yet. And then white states don't report. And so we don't know. We don't know what's going on there. We have some information from the Pulse survey. It's really wonderful at kind of giving us some hints into these states that don't report annual state data, but we can't put it on the map on this slide. Okay, we got into this a little bit about why people are homeschooling, and Mike talked about push and pull. I also think about push and pull. I think one of the fallacies about homeschooling is, people choose it, and that is true. People do choose that. Some people have the privilege of going through the many choices that are available to us and picking whatever we think is best. But there are a lot of people who are being pushed towards homeschooling or pushed out of more traditional models, and they're coming to homeschooling because it is the best option or the last option for their families that meets that. The reasons that people homeschool are also very different. So it depends on who you are and where you are, what you look like, how your family's set up. But families are concerned about safety, bullying, racism, culturally relevant instruction or culturally relevant curriculum. The numbers, we think, of SPED students in homeschooling are extremely high. Some estimates up to 30% of the entire homeschool population identify as having some sort of special need. Also huge populations of gifted and talented kids. So, people at different ends of the spectrum that aren't, getting their needs met in the middle are exiting towards homeschooling. How do people homeschool? So this is kind of my attempt at like a spectrum of homeschool choice. When you think about homeschooling, you're probably thinking, it's the ideological reason, right? And all kids in that family are going to be homeschooled always at home by the parent, right? That's what people think when they think homeschooling. That is not that is happening in some families, but we see huge amounts of variation about what people are doing when it comes to homeschooling, virtual, hybrid, co-op, all the way down to micro schools. Micro schools are often legally classified as homeschooling in a state, but they're not homeschooling. Like it looks much more like a traditional private school. Oftentimes they're very small, but sometimes they're not small. Sometimes micro schools have 150 students and they've grown over time, right? So lots and lots of variation. In several states, homeschools are legally classified as a private school, so it gets very, very confusing here how this all works. That has a lot of legal ramifications too, how kids are classified and what kind of services they can get, SPED services and such, depending on their classification. And then we have all kinds of other things going on. So we've got hubs and pods and world schools, and then these supplemental programs, all of these different kinds of things. Also, we've been spending a lot of time looking at access to the local public school. So in most states, homeschool students have access to their local traditional public school for things like football or chess club or chemistry class. That selection, assortment of things they have access to varies by state. Some states you only get sports. Some states you only get a core course. Some states offer you everything, but we're seeing more and more of this access for homeschool students to access some things at their local public school, usually for free. The state pays for it, but the parents don't have to. Then the other part of the how, right, is the regulation that we're going to talk a little bit about today. It's important to understand, if you don't know, homeschooling is regulated at the state level or controlled at the state level. Every state's different. The policy is different in every single state. So we created the Homeschool at a Glance. This is what you're looking at. I've got these. They're wonderful. Homeschool at a Glance across all 50 states. So you can really see a comparison of, what does homeschool regulation look like on some of the key topics like testing and notice of intent and some of these things that are common across a lot of states. So we have that for you as well if you would like that. And then just kind of moving forward in the research lab, we're doing a lot of research. We're partnering with a lot of people, other academics and other institutions, as well as people in the homeschool community to try to generate this new information, building relationships. And ultimately, what we hope is to inform evidence-based policy so that we have the facts that we need to make policies that are the best fit for our families and communities and society. So thank you very much. Also glad to answer questions. Yes, thanks. Oh, sorry.
Okay, hello, I'm Dalena Wallace, and I believe I'm here to represent homeschool moms and what's happening amongst us and kind of the new wave of homeschooling. I do also represent the traditional homeschool mom who would do this because of my faith. I have a very strong Christian faith, and that forms my education. It forms my philosophy and education. And however, I've been homeschooling my kids. I have 6 kids, and I've been homeschooling them for over 10 years. And at this point, I can say I cannot do it all by myself. I cannot homeschool all 6 of my kids in every subject 5 days a week by myself. And I kind of got to that point of realization about 3 to 5 years ago. And I started to realize if I'm feeling this way, there's got to be other moms like this. There's got to be other moms that wish they could homeschool, but they're like, no, there's no way I could do it like that. If homeschooling has to look like that. And so I've just become incredibly passionate about this new wave of these different educational models, these micro schools, these hybrid schools, because I believe that they offer hope. I believe that they offer a new opportunity for families that otherwise would not have been able to homeschool. And so just to give you a little bit of background, I live in a tiny town called Partridge, Kansas. We have a population of 208 people. And so when we talk about opportunity and we talk about options, as you can imagine, I'm very limited in the support and in various options. And so I opened my own home to start a micro school and invited a couple of other homeschooling families in with me. And through that process, other families in the community started to learn about it. And they were like, hey, can we join? And I'm like, well, my home's only so big. But thankfully, our church owned a former public school building, which is another really cool thing. And we were able to open this up. And at this point, we've developed into a co-op. So I founded a micro school and then founded a co-op, and we're going into our 8th year. I'm no longer the director of that co-op, I'm the founder of it. But meanwhile, we've been able to serve 60 students a year, which might not sound like a lot, but remember, I come from a town of 208 people. So we're doing big things there in Partridge, Kansas. But I wanted to kind of explore and see who else is doing something like this, because I believe in it. And I believe that this offers hope for more families. Just a little bit more background, I would open my home for something called coffee talks, and I would invite homeschooling moms from the community to come in quarterly, and we would share support, and we would just kind of talk about like the resources, kind of best practices, like, what's helpful, what's not. But through that process, I heard about families, these moms who were getting extremely weary and overwhelmed, and I could relate to that, and I thought, okay, so I'm not the only one. And then some of them were saying, we go to a psychologist and he says, my number one client is the homeschooling mom. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. So there was anxiety, there was overwhelm, a sense of isolation. And I just thought, there are solutions for this. And it's called microschooling, hybrid schooling, co-oping. And so I started to reach out to others in the community, outside of Partridge. I drove to Wichita and started calling people up and meeting them for coffee. I'm like, you started a school? Let's meet for coffee and let's learn from each other. Through that, I started a network where we just provide support. There's 26 micro school founders in the city of Wichita. There's more than that, but in our little network, there's 26 of us, and we meet with each other monthly with the goal to support, encourage, and grow this movement. So that's why I'm here. I'm representing, what's happening. And there's also the new wave of homeschoolers who are coming on. So I kind of come from the traditional, but I got a little overwhelmed and needed some extra help. But there are these new families that want to exit public schools right now. And they're like, what am I going to do? I work full time. My husband works full time. I can't do this. So there's another way. And so I believe in this movement of micro schools and hybrid schools, and know that it's something that provides amazing opportunity and support for homeschool families.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie McDonald, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, where I host the Liberated podcast and lead the Education Entrepreneurship Lab. I'm also the Valinda Johnson Family Education Fellow at State Policy Network, so my work really blends storytelling through the twice-weekly podcast, where I spotlight the stories of these entrepreneurial parents and teachers who are creating innovative schooling options, and state policy of sort of identifying some of the barriers that these everyday entrepreneurs encounter when they're trying to build these creative schooling options. I am also a homeschooling mom. My oldest is 17, always been homeschooled. She's in senior year now, doing the college application process. We've always been secular homeschoolers. And my 3 younger ones were always homeschooled up until about 2022. Now they attend the Sudbury Valley School, which some of you know, in Framingham, Mass., that was founded in 1968 as part of the free school movement, which is really, I think, a predecessor for what we see now in a lot of ways with the modern microschool movement. So I live right here in Cambridge, so I'm thrilled that you came to my backyard. So I am sad, though, that you weren't able to hear from Alycia Wright, who was supposed to be the panelist, talking about her role in running Cultural Roots homeschool cooperative, homeschool co-op. She is extraordinary. She's a former public school teacher in Virginia who taught middle school for over a decade, and then shifted to homeschooling when her oldest, who was gifted, she didn't feel like her needs were being met in kindergarten. And there's more to that story too. I'd encourage you to listen to my podcast episode with her to hear more about her experience in seeing how the conventional public schools in her community, where she taught and which were sought after, were really not going to meet the needs of her oldest gifted child as well as her three other children. So she began homeschooling and decided, I think a lot like Dalena, that it was a moment to bring together other people in her community in Richmond, Virginia, who shared similar values and similar experiences. And she wasn't finding what she was looking for. So she, like so many of today's innovative educators, built what she couldn't find. So she founded Cultural Roots Homeschool Co-op in 2016. And today it serves over 100 mostly Black and brown homeschool students, really focused on culturally relevant curriculum and respecting everyone's sort of ethnic and racial backgrounds and history. She also serves dozens of other homeschoolers out in the larger Richmond, Virginia homeschooling community with regular field trips and other kinds of extracurricular opportunities. But her co-op meets twice weekly at a local community center. She also has a micro school that she recently created for high school age students, but it's a full K-12 homeschool co-op. And unlike what we might think of as sort of a traditional homeschool co-op where parents take turns teaching various subjects, she is using all sort of hired educators from the community, some people who do volunteer but are sort of experts in their fields who are coming in to teach those classes and give the moms a much needed break, as I think Dalena referred to. So she's just doing incredible work and I think is representative of a lot of what we're seeing across the US in terms of these innovative models. I know we're also talking here about regulatory barriers for some of these everyday entrepreneurs. And so I thought I'd share a couple of other examples of what I'm seeing in terms of difficulties that some founders may be encountering. And I think, for example, of the story of Sharon Massanelli in Georgia, who is a physician associate, had been homeschooling her 8 kids for a number of years and had them in a hybrid school in Georgia outside of Atlanta. And she was traveling an hour each way to send her kids to this hybrid school. And for those of you who don't know about hybrid schools, I would recommend that you read Eric Warren's lovely book all about hybrid homeschooling and the research that he's done. But they are, typically 2 to 3 days a week of drop-off programs that are classes are led by hired teachers. And typically, students are either recognized as homeschoolers or in some cases, they could be private school students. In the case of Sharon's program, they are recognized as homeschoolers. The drive was getting tough for her, so she decided in 2019 that she was going to launch her own hybrid homeschool program. And she started with about 47 students, then COVID hit, and her enrollment has skyrocketed to now over 120 K-12 students in her hybrid school called St. John the Baptist School. And students in her program attend 3 days a week. The other 2 days they're at home with their family or in the community. And things were going really well up until the summer of 2021 when the fire marshal came into her facility. And actually, it was the summertime. There were only 7 kids and 2 adults in a summer camp as part of her hybrid program. And the fire marshal said, you can't operate here in this church because this church is not zoned properly for educational occupancy. And even though the church was fully up to code, had all occupancy certificates, was able to have a large Sunday school running educational programs on Sundays, as soon as Monday came along, Sharon and her program were deemed to be illegally running there. So the fire marshal went ahead and shut her down, but she was able to connect with the Institute for Justice. I know Michael Vindis is here from the Institute for Justice to to help her wade through this. And what happened in Georgia was during COVID, Georgia became the first state to pass the Learning Prod Protection Act, which several other states then followed suit. And so the Institute for Justice was able to say, you know what, I think she's able to operate here under this new Learning Pod Protection Act that enabled these innovative learning models to operate without being required to comply with the same regulations and occupancy requirements that mass schooling models are required to comply with. And so that worked. The Institute for Justice sent a letter to the fire marshal, and they were able to make it through that and continue operating. They also did go ahead and get their educational occupancy certificate as well. So all in all, things worked out well there. But there were other hybrid schools that were very similar to Sharon's in that general area that were so spooked by the fire marshal showing up and saying that you need to stop operations right now that they ended up shutting down again. Hundreds of students being displaced, many of them coming over to Sharon's program and some others. But it's just a reminder that we have, in many cases, sort of antiquated regulations and zoning requirements and occupancy codes that are meant for 1,000-person traditional schools and that are not necessarily meant for these innovative models, part-time programs, and other kinds of programs. So I'll just give you one other example, sort of similar story, but it's where the Learning Pod Protection Act actually didn't help one of these entrepreneurs. And this is a case in Texas. So Texas was another state that passed a Learning Pod Protection Act during the COVID time to, again, sort of protect these emerging schooling models. And Amber Okolo Abube runs a homeschool co-op and microschool program called Leading Little Arrows. She has always homeschooled her 5 children, one of whom is autistic. And in the spring of 2022, she decided, like Alycia, that she couldn't find what she really wanted. She wanted a program that was going to be much more focused on the experience of Black and Brown students, as well as being inclusive of neurodiverse students. And so again, she built what she couldn't find and launched Leading Little Arrows in the spring of 2022, starting with sort of a weekly homeschool co-op that just met outside at a local park. That grew in popularity. More families wanted in. So then she incubated her program in someone else's microschool for the fall of 2022, and that continued to grow and gain momentum. So in the spring of 2023, she leased a standalone, beautiful building. I had the opportunity to visit it right after she moved in, right across the street from the University of Texas at Arlington. And she was serving, at the time, over 35 students, about 85% of whom were neurodiverse, and the vast majority were homeschoolers of color. And they were coming again with paid educators, hired educators, giving the parents a break, the moms a break for this program. She also was starting to create a microschool that met more regularly and offered additional academic supports for students, and was expanding to another location in Irving, Texas. She's based in Fort Worth, Texas. She was expanding to a second location because demand was so high in Irving, about 25 miles north. So what happened was, fast forward a year, everything's going great. She's about to open her second location. Her enrollment numbers are growing. And again, as she says, we came up against our good friends, the fire marshal and zoning. And she was required to shut down. She didn't know that she was in violation, again, of these codes that were meant for traditional large mass schooling models, and was told that she had to leave. Now, she talked to some attorneys, and they said, you could fight this. You can stay here under the Texas Learning Pod Protection Act. We think that you can fight this and win. And she said, you're right, I probably can, but that's not where I want my energy going. I want to be serving families. I want to be teaching and helping to connect these homeschooling families to create these wonderful educational solutions. I don't have the energy or the desire to fight this, even if I'll win. And so I think it's just a reminder that these regulations, while they can be extremely helpful, as they were in the case of Sharon and her program in Georgia, they may not always work as desired. And I think a larger message is maybe sort of some cultural change, a cultural shift in recognizing that education is very different and it can look very different from traditional schooling models, and thinking about ways to support these creative schooling options and enable them to flourish.
I must say, pretty impressive for being tapped just an hour ago. So well done. When I think back before the pandemic, you still had some debates floating around about whether homeschooling should even be allowed at all. And then we kind of go through the pandemic, and that seems to be dead. I don't see those debates at all anymore. Instead, the debate is more something like, well, what types of regulations how should homeschooling be regulated? And what regulation is appropriate, if any at all? And it seems to me that whenever I see homeschooling in the media or get into the mainstream in some way, it's usually some kind of horror story, right? It's a family who they're identified in the media as being homeschoolers. But when you kind of look at the case, they're not really doing anything that resembles homeschooling. They're just kind of using the regulatory umbrella to kind of neglect their regulatory umbrella for homeschooling to neglect their children. So my question is, what types of, as homeschooling grows and expands, and it seems to have expanded quite a bit, is there any regulation that's appropriate?
No.
It just comes down to that question: whose children are they? Are they wards of the state? Should they be, or are parents in charge of and should be monitoring their education as well as everything else in their life? So, I mean, it just depends on where you land on that, I suppose.
So I try to step lightly on the regulation question, but, for me, in looking at this, from a research perspective and from an education policy perspective, homeschools seem to be a type of private school, especially more and more so, right? They're more and more like what we would think of as a private school model. If they're not publicly funded, right? If we're doing this private school thing, certainly the ceiling to me should not be any higher for homeschoolers than other private schoolers. And we don't have a lot of regulation on private schooling. Private schoolers aren't forced to take tests and report all the things, right? And so that seems like a reasonable ceiling. Like, we definitely shouldn't go over that ceiling for this brand of private schooling versus other brands of private schooling.
So in Oklahoma, you actually, if you decide to homeschool, you don't have to report to your local district, really to anyone.
Sure.
Do you think homeschooling families should have to report to some entity, to the local district or wherever that they are deciding to homeschool? I
mean, I don't really get into deciding those kinds of things. We're dealing more with like the facts. From a research perspective, we would love for people to report things because that gives us more data.
Well, that's what I'm getting at here.
But it's unethical for a researcher to take data from people unwillingly, right? We don't do that in research, in any kind of research. You don't do that. And so, forcing people to do things so that I can have the data is extremely unethical, so I would be against that. The other thing that I think about a lot on this is sticks and carrots. So there are a lot of sticks that we as a society could employ on people to force them to do whatever we think is the thing. But there are also a lot of carrots. And so I'm really curious and kind of looking at carrots that we could use if, for example, if we as a society think that testing is super awesome. And there's a lot of pushback in just regular education policy about how valuable really these testing results are and how accurate they are and all the things. And they're very expensive and all the things. But let's say we like testing and we think we need this testing. If we really are that concerned about that, we could, instead of forcing people to do the thing, we could offer a carrot and give them a free test. Several states offer homeschool families the option to take the state test. Fine. If it's voluntary, they can go in, they can take the test. If they have to report the data, then things get kind of sticky. But if it was just to inform the parents about the learning of their child, then and it's optional, that seems like a wonderful carrot. Some families may not want to take the state test. Some of the state tests aren't super great. And so you could offer a $40 voucher to homeschool families so that they could choose the test of their choice. So I think that there are a lot of avenues that we could look at that are more voluntary, that could help meet everybody's needs while not infringing too much on what people are doing, and unfairly so. If we're not doing it to other private schoolers, then we shouldn't be picking on homeschoolers.
Okay, I'll leave it at one question because I think we're going to have a few questions in the room here. Yeah, right there.
Yeah, I appreciate the commentary. My name is Kevin Boder with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. It seems to me that the deregulation of home education has allowed it to flourish and has led to these micro schools, hybrid environments. Shouldn't the discussion really be around reducing the regulation on other educational models instead of increasing the regulation on homeschooling, which seems to be the focus?
I mean, maybe, yeah, I don't know.
That didn't look like a maybe there, but okay. I think they're in agreement with you. So why don't we move on to the next question? Yeah, so let's just go right here in the front row where Drew is. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Michelle Barmazon. I'm the president of the Massachusetts Association for Gifted Education, in a state that doesn't have gifted education. We don't. We find that a lot of our community is being forced to homeschool because the schools aren't meeting the needs of the kids. And a lot of the kids, so in a state that doesn't have gifted education, it's a state that does really focus on supporting learning disabilities. So if a kid is twice exceptional, which means gifted with a learning disability, they will tend to go to the public schools and they will get free services for the support that they need on the lower end, but their kids are languishing on the upper end. So my question is, do you think that parents who are homeschooling would prefer to not have to homeschool and keep their kids in the regular school systems? Are they going to homeschooling because they want to or because they have to?
Do you have data, Angela? Yeah.
So I don't have any information pertinent to that. However, by increasing the access to public schools, we can see, right? So we do know how many states provide access and for public schools for homeschool students. We know how many states have access and what type of access they have. What we don't know is how many students are availing themselves of those opportunities. And so that would be really interesting to know. How many homeschoolers are going to schools to do the things. You're very lucky. If your special needs students are in this state are getting services, you're lucky. Because in most states, special needs services, kids are not getting them. The homeschool kids cannot get special needs services, or they're very, very limited, or they're determined at the district level, or even at the individual school principal determines whether or not the kid gets services. So, it would be interesting to see. And we would also love to have that data, but you would have to release then that data for us to have, so.
Yeah, I might just add to, in terms of who are the folks who are actually building these micro schools and learning pods and homeschooling collaboratives and other kinds of creative schooling options. The vast majority of them are former public school teachers. So for sure, the ones that I've interviewed, about 3/4 of them are former public school teachers, if not more. The National Microschooling Center's sector analysis earlier this year also found that 75% of today's founders are former public school teachers who grow disillusioned by the standardization and stagnation and test-driven environment of traditional schools and know that they can do something better. I know we have Kenneth Stanford in the audience, who created North Star back in 1996, a self-directed learning center for teens that continues to flourish today and has led to, inspired so many other self-directed learning centers across the country. He was also one of those disillusioned public school teachers who created something new. And so I think that we're seeing that both teachers and parents are looking for more individualized models that focus on each child's needs and interests and not that kind of one-size-fits-all system.
And I also think you touch on a point as far as parents feeling forced into homeschooling for one reason or another. It might be because their student has special needs and whatever they would be better served at home or versus, better served in the public school, like you mentioned. But sometimes families are just, their hands are forced in a situation. So I don't have like the data that Mike McShane would have. I have more like the anecdotal data here. But what I'm seeing is that, for example, in Wichita, 6 public schools were closed just this past year. 15,000 students have left the public school system since 2020. So schools are closing, and in my area, I can drive around. This was one of the other reasons that just kind of motivated me and made me realize, like, we need more options. I can drive around about a 20-minute drive, go in this little radius and see 12 former public schools that were community-based public schools that have been closed over the years. So that idea, the public school is consolidating. They are busing children sometimes 2 hours a day. And this, again, is forcing parents' hands into something that maybe they had never considered and really didn't want to do, but they feel like they have no other options, which just motivates me more to help and to bring support for those families who feel kind of forced into a situation they weren't expecting or intending to do.
Can I add one thing to that real
Yeah.
quick? So adding to what Dalena was saying, so I live in Arkansas, I work remotely. I live in Arkansas, it's a very rural state. We just passed a universal ESA in Arkansas, so it's gonna be really interesting to see what happens there with homeschooling. But what I was talking about earlier about, breaking it down from national to regional to state to local, we see huge concentrations of homeschoolers in rural areas. And so that could be some sort of an ideological thing, or it could be there's just not a whole lot of choice, like what she's describing. They don't have the dynamic choice available to them. And so it's either the local traditional public school or they homeschool, because either there's not a private or they can't afford it, because we're also rural and poor. And so that is something definitely to consider in all of this as well.
Are you considering the full-time virtual school students as homeschooled students in your data?
So the data that we report for the state registered homeschoolers is what the state gives us. And who is counted in that varies by every state. So, it depends on who's counted and whether or not they report to the state.
And so you would consider a full-time virtual school student a homeschooler depending on how the state reports it?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Yes, right over here. Okay, why don't we start back down? We'll head your way. Yeah, that'll be easier for Drew.
Okay, I want to go back to the regulation question because I think that it's coming. The question about regulation is coming, again, very loudly because of the numbers increasing. Eventually, people are going to get wind to the back doors that are being utilized, right? And also because of the new population that's coming in, right? Not being the traditional old homeschoolers where it's just a mom and her kids at the kitchen table. So, do you guys see a change in population and their appetite for regulation in the folks that you're talking to, kind of giving a tit for tat, right? If they give us this, we'll give them that, right? Or do you see any kind of like public traditional schools or public districts kind of responding to this change in their, community, like what you said, like 12 closed public schools, yet where are all the kids going, right? Like, is anybody in the public districts noticing and changing something to where they're enticing people to come back for one reason or another?
Yeah, well, in regards to the traditional homeschool families who have said, we don't want to look at other options, we're comfortable doing it this way, they are, in a sense, applying a little bit of pressure to this, like they are wanting to hold very tightly to that definition of, we are homeschoolers, we don't know what you're doing. Like all the new people who are coming on and who are doing this hybrid model, who have online courses, they might take part-time classes elsewhere, they might hire tutors. There's all these different varieties, and the traditional homeschoolers are being really protective of that definition. And so I find that interesting. But the new wave of homeschoolers, the ones that are coming in who are just like leaving the public school for one reason or another, they're totally open to options and ideas and possible like ESAs or some sort of school choice program. But from the traditional homeschoolers, there's that very strong resistance. So it's very interesting. There's that rub there. And I see value. Like, again, I kind of have a foot in both worlds because I very much respect those traditional homeschoolers who are like, don't mess with us. We don't want to report. We don't want anything. We don't want your money anyways. But then there's the new wave of moms who were like, well, I want options. I would love that funding if that would open up this opportunity for my student or my child. So.
Yes, you were next, and then we'll go over here.
My question, I'm from Washington State, which is moderately regulated, I guess you'd say. But I went to a Vela conference recently and was blown away by the microschool movement, which isn't even up there in Washington State at all, because homeschooling is defined as a parent teaching their own children. Anything else, they can be in a parent partnership with the public schools, but other than that, it's traditional homeschooling. My questions are twofold. One, how prevalent is that kind of regulation where it's only homeschooling? And second of all, how do states move from that kind of tight regulation to getting to the place where they have some more options like the microschool or the other movements we're seeing?
So I think there are only a few states where you're only allowed to homeschool, a parent is only allowed to homeschool their own child. Now, there are limits. Some states, it's your child plus one other family. Like, you can't bring 5 families in. A lot of that changed during the pandemic with the pandemic pods. But I mean, yeah, like we discussed in the earlier panel, it's getting very murky, and it's very difficult to figure out who is in which bucket, and we don't know. So like the homeschool numbers could be inflated by people who are actually microschooling. Now that's definitely happening in some states where microschoolers are legally considered homeschoolers, but in other states, Colorado, I think there was somebody here from Colorado. Colorado is an example. There are multiple methods. There are multiple tracks into homeschooling. So you could homeschool with I can't remember exactly all of the Colorado ways, but there are like 4 different ways, and one of them could be a tutor, and one of them could be as part of a private school. And it's unclear even to us which bucket those kids are going into when we get the Colorado numbers. I suspect that the Colorado numbers that we have are the defined homeschoolers, and that kids who are homeschooling through a private school are counted in the private school bucket. So it gets very confusing, and maybe we come to some sort of point where we're going to have to kind of throw up our hands, because I don't know how, part of the problem, what we were talking about earlier about the fire and safety regulation, like we all want fire alarms in places where kids are. Like everybody, reasonable would agree with that, I think. But the laws and the legislation just can't keep up. Parents are innovating so fast. There are so many new models coming out all of the time. We just can't keep up with all that is going on. And so at some point, I don't know if we have to say, it's a school and move on. I don't know.
Yes.
Respond to that, his comment.
Pardon?
Can I respond to the
You want to respond to his comment? Okay, sure.
Hi. I hear that concern a lot from people in states, and I urge people just to disregard it. I think that, as you just said, the culture is so far ahead of the reality. Even your most conventional homeschooling parents have tutors and helpers and teachers, and a Thursday class that's a nature class that's led by a professional. And no one's counting, no one's inspecting, and to live in fear of getting caught would really stop a lot of innovation. So I would encourage you to just go for it. And then, as needed, HSLDA is, way ahead of us, clearing the decks. So, the state is not checking on every family to count their hours. It's not plausible. It's way too creative right now.
Can I just add to that too? So he just said about hours, right? So some of these regulations, and somebody was saying earlier about antiquated regulation. So what we see in a lot of states is these really antiquated regulations that were passed in 1984 when homeschooling was just barely becoming legal in the United States. And they say that you have to school your child from 8 to 3, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Like, that's not how any of this is happening anymore. And so that's not how people that's not how people work nowadays, right? And so, some of these regulations are just really antiquated, and to that point, they're unenforceable. No one is checking to make sure that you're schooling from 8 to 3 on Monday through Friday, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think we had one right back here.
Yeah, so hi, I'm a 16-year-old homeschooled senior. This is my first conference. It's absolutely wonderful. So my mom is my primary teacher, and my dad works from home, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were on like that kind of imbalance, because when you're talking about it, you often refer to homeschooled moms as being the primary teacher, and I see that a lot in, homeschooled communities and organizations where there is, that primary teacher and organizer is female and often a mom. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
So we do have some new information coming out with that. I have a co-authored paper with Albert Chang that we're getting forthcoming that looks at the National Household Education Survey, and within that it asks about parents who homeschool and then who is the primary instructor or whatever. We're seeing more, so this is the stereotype, right, that it's the mom at the table with the 4 kids, and this is what we all, I think, go to in our mind, but that's not really what's happening. So we really have to challenge each other and ourselves about these stereotypes, but more and more men are involved in instructing their children. I met a young academic. She and her husband homeschool their child. He's the primary instructor. They have grandma school during the day. The grandma keeps the kids during the day, and the dad does the instruction at night and on the weekends because he works, right? So they figured out how to make it work. I also think the stereotype is you have to have 2 parents. We're seeing more and more single parent households who are able to homeschool. I work remotely. People work remotely. That enables parents, a single parent, to potentially homeschool a child because they are home. Another thing that we talked about a little bit, and I didn't cover it in the slides, but is about age. So when you have older students, they can be more self-directed, and younger students. During the pandemic, about 70%, we don't have a lot of information on student age in our state reported data. Very few states report that, but of the ones that do, about 70% of the increase in homeschooling was in younger grades. So these were first, second, third graders in most states. We weren't seeing huge influxes of 8th graders during the pandemic. So these were younger students. We don't really know exactly why that is. That could be that moms and dads didn't want their littles to have to wear masks all day at school or something related to COVID things happening. But it could also be that younger kids have younger parents, and that this younger generation of parents is more accepting of homeschooling. It was less stigmatized for them when they were growing up. They know people who were homeschooled. They could be more tech savvy and willing to do things online, et cetera.
So, Dalena or Carrie, did you have a comment on any of this?
I just appreciate you being here, number one. That's awesome. And just as far, I think it's wonderful. If my husband could help a little more, I would love that too. But he travels, but I think it's amazing to have the partnership. And you're right. It can be a mutual thing. I think it should be. So.
Yes. Where's Drew, actually? Okay, yeah, Drew. Right around the corner. Drew, hurry up. Okay.
Yeah. So I think this blends a couple of questions. And I come at this from the perspective of having run virtual public schools, but our Venn diagram kind of crosses over, right? And while I'm in favor of less regulation, I think how do you answer the question of, and this has happened to me, where you have the family at home, and it's a family that looked for different options as a way to hide, and there was ongoing kind of social work concerns, and they didn't want to be found because there was abuse happening in the home. So I think that's where probably the regulation concern comes in, largely over child welfare. So how do you answer that? Because I feel like that's the biggest danger for regulation, right? And how do you answer that hook?
Carrie might have something to say.
Yeah, I would just say that that's a CPS issue. That's a Child Protective Services issue. That's not a homeschooling issue. There are bad actors parents, bad parents who send their kids to public school, private school, homeschool. Thankfully, it's very, very tiny. And, there's also rampant abuse within public schools where we think about children being abused by peers, by teachers. So, I don't think we're ever going to eliminate that, but I think in terms of regulation, regulating a group of people for doing something like homeschooling because of fear of a few bad apples will really, sort of create this stifling effect on what is a very innovative sector at the moment.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more quick question. Oh, okay, so everyone's pointing over here, so I think there's a good one here.
Thanks. I've enjoyed the panel a lot. I've homeschooled, my wife and I homeschooled, unschooled our 3 daughters. They're in their 30s now. Everything is fine. I've published a magazine that I inherited from John Holt, so I've been involved in homeschooling since 1981. And it's so refreshing to hear these things come to fruition, but I just like to point out that homeschool co-ops existed in the 1980s. I worked with my daughters at home when my wife was working, and a lot of it was not instruction, by the way. It was doing things with them, taking them places, and goodness gracious, sleepovers. But my question is to Angela, because I've always been amazed at the tin ear that public schools have had towards homeschooling. And here in Massachusetts, like they wouldn't, they lose something like $4,000 if our child is enrolled in the local public school. And I don't see, why they wouldn't do that, and they say, oh no, they have to be here full time, and so they're losing out on that money when, I know a lot of homeschooling families probably, if they even did want to use the school, it would be for like the plays or the sports or something like that. So they're not going to be spending a lot of teacher money on this. So what public, are there any, and so as a result, it's very hard. I mean, we were able to make private arrangements with our public school, and that worked out for one of our daughters to take Spanish class. But why, so you cited earlier that there were public schools that are cooperating with homeschool. So tell us more about that, please.
Yeah. Okay, so on this homeschool at a glance, I have 4 columns that each talk about the access. So each state is on here, and then we talk about sports access, course access, extra, which is extracurriculars, and then SPED services, and whether or not that state legally requires the public schools to offer those services and those opportunities to homeschooled students. And so the trend is most states do that. I think only 8 states offer nothing. So most states offer something. Now, it's not a full assortment in every state, but it definitely is kind of trending that way, and it is an awesome way for the public school to recoup some of these losses. They get funding for that whatever amount of time that student is at the public school taking chemistry, or I don't know about extracurriculars and chess club and things like that, but they do get funding for the courses. So it seems like a definite win to me for public schools who are suffering this declining enrollment. But there's politics and stuff involved there, I'm sure.
Okay, all right. Well, I think we could probably keep going, but we've got a keynote coming up. But wonderful panel. Thank you. Carrie, really appreciate it. Great job as always.